So I assume it's just tested also. So I assume I don't have the virus, so I don't have to worry about spreading it. Okay? Please go ahead.
Mr. President, I want to make sure we're clear. When you mentioned tariffs earlier that came up in the meeting, are you considering tariffs on Saudi Arabian oil? And then also,
Look, tariffs have made a tremendous amount of money for our country. I put them on China, I put them on other places, and other countries tariff us, and they take advantage of us, and they have for many years. Look, countries have taken advantage of the United States for years. They've ripped us off like nobody can even believe, whether it be on manufacturing, whether it be on exporting, whether it be on almost anything, including military, where we provide virtually free military assistance to countries that frankly take advantage of us, don't even like us, okay? So this has been going on for years. They tariff us. They create artificial, you could say non-financial barriers, which are worse than financial barriers. You can't sell your product. You can't take care of our farmers. They won't take and yet they'll take us and sell into us. And we won't charge them anything for doing it. Look, they've taken advantage of us for years. Tariffs are a way of evening the score. Tariffs are a way of just neutralizing. They have tariffs on us, and we now can put tariffs on them. Am I using it for oil? It's something we can. No. Am I doing it now? No. Am I thinking about imposing it as of this moment? No. But if we're not treated fairly, it's certainly a tool in the toolbox.
And what about with Russia? Would you consider maybe lifting sanctions or giving some sanctions
relief?
Well,
it would be the same thing. No, it'd be the same thing. They are having a dispute, the two countries, and it's hurting the rest of the world because it's really hurting the energy industry. Russia is being hurt unbelievably badly, and Saudi Arabia is being hurt unbelievably badly because oil and gas is a primary, that's where they get most of their income. And this is a price like from the 1950s. All right? It's a price from the 1950s. They are being hurt very badly. I think they're going to settle their dispute pretty quickly.
Why, on the oil, why do you
Mr. President,
raise the price? Why do you think you haven't been more successful in getting them to increase production in Russia and Saudi Arabia?
Well, they have increased production. That's what they've done. They've increased it so much that there's, so you meant the opposite.
Why do you have been successful?
Well, they're going to stop because ultimately the market is going to get them to stop. But they both did the opposite. They increased production to a level that water is right now more valuable than oil. Who would have ever thought, right? You go to some of these kingdoms, water is far more valuable than oil. There's so much oil. It's a tribute in a way. But what happened is there was a lot to start off with, and then you had the virus, and it knocked the hell out of the market in terms of demand. So there's no demand, and there's tremendous supply. So, I mean, you saw numbers where it was down to 20 and down, frankly, below 20. It was even below 20. It's an incredible thing, the market. But ultimately, the marketplace will take care of it. But I think they're going to work out their problem fairly quickly. Okay, go ahead.
Mr. President, thank you, Mr. President. We're already talking about phase 4 of a stimulus, right? But you and Pelosi and McConnell are already talking about different things that should be in it. Now, last time, people were telling me that the fact that you wouldn't talk to Pelosi was an impediment and it really slowed things down. Are you
talk? If it were important to talk to her, I'd talk to her. If it were important for the American people, I'd talk to her. But other than that, I can have other people talking to her. Look, you ready? Infrastructure is a great thing for me. I think infrastructure for this country, we have an old broken infrastructure. 50 years ago, we were the envy of the world. And then we spent all this money so stupidly in the Middle East. It's going to be very close to $8 trillion in the Middle East. How stupid was that decision? But they spent it on that and other things. We've got to fix our infrastructure. That means roads, highways, tunnels, airports, everything. We got to fix our infrastructure. And the beauty is because of the fact that we are so strong as a country, we're borrowing at zero. We never had a chance to borrow at zero. Even this country, we never had a chance to borrow at zero. We're going to borrow. This is a great time. so we can fix our infrastructure and we'll have almost no interest costs. This is the time to do it. Steve, one more question.
The death toll projection that you shared with us earlier this week, are we still on the current trajectory for that, or have social...
Which one? I made trajectories for many things.
100 to 240,000. Are we still on that trajectory, or have we made any improvements, or maybe not enough time?
Say, Steve.
Have we made enough improvements?
On what?
On social distancing.
I'd have to ask Dr. Fauci, and I'd have to ask Deborah. Have the models changed?
So a lot of the projections you can see are based on, there's many different ways to look at this. And as we discussed on Sunday, some of it is based on the current global experience. We're about, I think, 6.5 or 5.5 times the size of Italy, a different factor in Spain. And we look at all of those, what their projections are, where they are currently, and where that is going. And so a lot of the work is based on how this virus has moved through other populations. That's a very direct way to see how the virus is impacting a population. There's also terrific models. And so every day and every night, one of the models that actually looks at the model related to mortality is the healthdata.org data. And they update it every night, and you can see where we are in that projection. I think in the last run of that model, they were at 93,000 or something in the model. Now, all of that can be changed by our behaviors. And all of it can be changed in a different way if we don't follow those behaviors. If another major metropolitan area ends up having an epidemic like the New York metro area, that could dramatically change not the model, but the reality of the impact of this virus on Americans.
By the way, the models show hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. You know what I want to do? I want to come way under the models. The professionals did the models. I was never involved in a model, but at least this kind of a model. But you know what? Hundreds of thousands of people, they say they're dead. I want much less than that. I want none, but it's too late for that. But I want very few people relative to what the models are saying. Those are projections. I hope they're wrong. I hope we're going to be under those projections.
Two questions on continuity of government.
How many of us have two? Why can't you have one?
Well, they're related.
Every time. I have three questions. I have two questions. Can you give me one instead? Because there are a couple of other people. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go with my second one. The governor of Wisconsin is now talking about delaying the primary, at least not having in-person voting. So my question is, and I asked this a couple weeks ago, I want to see if you've made any progress on this. Looking ahead to the fall, are you taking steps to ensure that the general election will happen even if this pandemic has reemerged or hasn't gone away?
The general election will happen on November 3rd. In Wisconsin, what happened is I, through social media, put out a very strong endorsement of a Republican conservative judge who's an excellent, brilliant judge. He's a justice. And I hear what happened is his poll numbers went through the roof. And because of that, I think they delayed the election.
Concerned about people going to in-person voting?
I don't know. Why didn't he do it before? He's doing it right before the election.
But do you think
Excuse me. Why did he do this 2 weeks ago? All of a sudden, all of a sudden an election, which is taking place very soon, gets delayed. Now, I just endorsed him today, and it was a very strong endorsement. His polls, he's gone very high up. And all of a sudden, the governor comes out, the Democrat governor, by the way, comes out and says, oh, we're going to move this election. So I don't know. I hope you're right.
But do you think every state in this country should be prepared for mail-in voting?
No, because I think a lot of people cheat with mail-in voting. I think people should vote with ID, voter ID. I think voter ID is very important. And the reason they don't want voter ID is because they intend to cheat. When you get something, when you buy something, you look at your cards and credit cards and different cards. You have your picture on many of them, not all of them, but on many of them. You should have a picture on your for voting. It should be called voter ID. They should have that. And it shouldn't be mail-in, it shouldn't be mail-in voting. It should be you go to a booth and you proudly display yourself. You don't send it in the mail where people pick up all sorts of bad things can happen by the time they sign that, if they sign that, by the time it gets in and is tabulated. No, it shouldn't be mailed in. You should vote at the booth and you should have voter ID. Because when you have voter ID, that's the real deal. Thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow.
We go back to hydroxychloroquine.
on the domestic travel. Secretary, it's on one website.
You just heard the president wrap up his press briefing, probably his shortest one of the week for those of us that are keeping score of that. And the president got a bit distracted there by some political things that he wanted to get to. But I think let's get to the big picture items of this briefing, the biggest one being we were looking for some clarity, and instead we got more confusion both on the supply chain and on these new CDC recommendations. I have a couple of doctors with me as well as Kristen Welker. So let me start with Dr. Redlener. I believe Erwin Wedlener is with me. Let me start with you and try to get some understanding of the president presented these new CDC recommendations on face coverings, which the president, someone might argue, might have undercut the idea when he said, well, it's voluntary, I'm not going to do it. Is that a message that helps convince people to wear a face covering?
No, it's actually characteristic of every other message we've gotten from President Trump since the beginning of this whole pandemic, where he, for many, many weeks, inappropriately was reassuring everybody that everything's fine, it's under control, it'll be over by April, the magical cure will happen, and so on and so forth. This was the latest and potentially the most overtly hypocritical message I've ever heard from anybody who says that my government just announced new recommendations that everyone should wear a mask, but I'm not going to. I mean, I am flabbergasted to try to understand how people will even interpret that message in coupling with what the president said he was going to do. What is that? You wouldn't do that with your own children. You would just simply you lose all credibility, which has already happened, I guess, with President Trump. But this was a pretty egregious disconnect between what his own government is recommending and what he says he's going to do personally. Very similar, by the way. Do you remember it wasn't long ago that he had people crowded on the stage with him in front of the podium, sharing the same microphone? It was just this kind of outrageous disconnect that we've come to experience with President Trump and the whole notion of messaging appropriately to the public.
I want to play, since it's been a while since people may have heard of what the president said on the mask, let me play that sound again, because it did literally contradicted the advice the second he gave it. Take a listen.
The CDC is recommending that Americans wear a basic cloth or fabric mask that can be either purchased online or simply made at home. It's going to be really a voluntary thing. You can do it. You don't have to do it. I'm choosing not to do it, but some people may want to do it, and that's okay. It may be good. Probably will. They're making a recommendation. It's only a recommendation.
Also with me is Dr. Nahid Badalia. Dr. Badalia, tell me, first of all, now that the CDC is saying this, we know that there's essentially an order on this in New York City. How important is it to do this when you leave the house?
So I actually like the approach that Surgeon General Adams took, which is he said, listen, this is evolving. We know that we told you not to do this before, but the reason we are moving to this new recommendation is because the science has changed. And what the science is saying is that there's a percentage of people who are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, which means that before they get sick, they're still shedding this virus that might get other people sick. And so I think that it's important to say it is a guidance. It's not, it's not everybody needs to do it, but the important points that he made were hand hygiene and why we want people to use face coverings, and also identifying why those are different than the masks that people are using in the healthcare setting. I think that's a better approach to sort of tell people what's necessary. You cover your face because you're protecting others from your virus shedding if you're sick and you don't yet know.
I also thought the Surgeon General did a good job of explaining how to do it. Like, oh, by the way, be sure you wash your hands before you put this mask on. I thought every which way he explained that policy, I think, was very helpful to the viewer. Kristen Welker, where there was also more confusion, was on the supply chain issues. and it seemed to be something that the president didn't want to acknowledge that there was confusion there. And it does seem as if we're hearing one thing from governors and one thing from the task force. Behind the scenes, is there any effort being made to try to streamline things, to try to create one point of contact?
Well, I think that what's happening behind the scenes, Chuck, is that there's a lot of confusion about who the point of contact is. And yesterday we saw that on display in the briefing room when you had Jared Kushner come out, and he really added fuel to the confusion and to this controversy when he talked about, quote unquote, our stockpile. And President Trump got so many questions about that today, pressed repeatedly on what specifically his son-in-law meant. Did he misspeak? The president said he was quite defensive and said, no, look, he didn't misspeak. The bottom line is we want to have flexibility in case we need to get emergency supplies to some of these states. But you heard this sort of defensive posture from the president that we heard from Kushner yesterday, which is that some of these governors didn't do a good enough job of stocking up in the first place. And so we're having to overcompensate for that. So I think this question of who is the point person on this issue continues to really loom over the government's response and the president's response to this crisis, Chuck.
Dr. Redlener, I want to actually ask you about a piece of news that took place right before this briefing started. And it was an alert that was sent out right there where you are, New York City. Basically an all call for healthcare workers. Explain what is happening there in New York City, that there's essentially an all call for extra workers.
Yeah, so Chuck, I got that alert myself. Usually the kind of thing where you're on a missing person or something going on, but I was really surprised to see that. But the message said, if you are a healthcare worker and are able to volunteer, we need you. And it gave an 800 number, local number to call. And this is really indicative of the overall extraordinary crisis that the city is facing. It's a crisis of supplies and equipment, of course, the personal protective equipment. It's a crisis of the actual rooms and ICU bed space, et cetera, and ventilators. But it's also a crisis of personnel. My son's an ER doctor in New York. And 3 days ago, a nurse colleague who we worked side by side with died of COVID. And I think we're seeing more and more doctors of all ages getting sick, having to leave work, or even worse, being admitted to the hospital in critical condition. So I think we're really looking down the barrel of a very serious crisis on all levels: personnel, equipment, supplies, and beds. And just a word, if I can, about the Strategic National Stockpile. The information that was put out by Kushner yesterday and the president today was just flat wrong. The Strategic National Stockpile was created specifically to supplement states and cities when there's a major crisis, and we've never had anything quite as severe as this. So that's exactly what it's for. I don't know what holding it back for the federal government even means, but it is just wrong. It flies in the face of why this stockpile was created and what it's supposed to be used for. It was extremely confusing and distressing to hear that. But anyway, we are facing a crisis of healthcare personnel as well as the supplies, and I don't think we're getting the help that we should have been getting for a long time now from the federal government on any of those fronts.
Dr. Bedelia, I want to ask you about an interesting question that was asked of Dr. Birx, and she didn't fully answer it, but it was because I think it's unanswerable right now, and that is this issue of trying, how quickly are we going to get this test for antibodies, and how difficult it's been, frankly, to get testing up and running in this country so that we can decide whether these medical workers can continue to work and maybe they don't need as much equipment because they have the antibodies. In a little more layman's terms there, explain what Dr. Birx was trying to convey.
Right. So Dr. Birx was talking in part about the FDA emergency use authorization that was made towards a test which tests your blood to basically look for proteins that your immune system creates if you've been exposed to and have recovered from a disease. So she's talking about the fact that this is available, and the hope is that this can become something that's even easier to run, so you don't need an entire tube of a person's blood. Potentially, you could do this off of dry blood. You could do this, in a manner that allows the person to find out that they, in fact, are immune. So herein is where it becomes a bit more difficult. So the antibodies, what we need to know, once the test tests you for antibodies, I think the scientific questions that are still remaining are, even if you have the antibodies, are there a portion of people who might still get sick? Is it enough to just have this appear on the test? And our experience with prior viruses similar to this say that's probably true. But the other part of this is for viruses like SARS-CoV-2, like regular coronaviruses, the immunity it's not lifelong. It doesn't last for a very long time. So what does it mean for us when this disease comes back next fall? And so a lot of both disease questions, but also getting to figure out if this test actually will do what it says it will do.
And in fact, explain why, Dr. Birx, I think I know the answer to this, but I want you to explain this again, Dr. Bedalia. Dr. Birx said, we'd really like to get to the USS Roosevelt and test all those folks because it sounds like they think that's an interesting, almost, you have a control group, that you can learn a lot just from what happened on that ship.
Yeah, and we actually, similar sort of epidemiological data came from the Diamond Princess cruise as well. You have a population that's in an enclosed area, so you know who their contacts are, right? Part of the reason that we can't get a handle on this idea of how many people get this disease and have no symptoms, and part of this is because our testing hasn't come up to par to be able to do that level of population sort of surveillance. But now you have this small group of people where you know where they're going to get this disease from, and you follow them out throughout their contact, and you can say with greater confidence, okay, they couldn't have gotten this from anywhere else, and they're still, look at their blood test, they're immune. That means they got this disease, they were never asymptomatic, and here's a good baseline of how many people, when they get exposed, don't get symptoms at all. So it's an interesting epidemiological population. I think if we can make that happen, we will contribute to the science on this.
It does certainly sound like that. Kristen Welker, I want to go back to the president here a little bit and I guess some confusion over what's coming next financially. I do think it's important to convey to viewers that a second round of money it appears to be coming. Mitch McConnell has now said it. Speaker Pelosi has now said it. And so has the president. So walk us through, is this going to happen later this month, we think, that they may come together quick again with essentially phase 3 a second time?
That's the anticipation. And of course, there couldn't be more pressure on all of them to do something quickly by the end of the month. And Chuck, remember, these guidelines continue to get extended. So when they were working on phase 3, at least the first part of it, we only were anticipating this essential shutdown to be supposed to last for 15 days. But of course, it's now been extended until the end of the month. And so the financial pain is being extended clearly. And so I think there's a lot of pressure on all sides to get things done. I would note that the president has talked a lot about the importance of bipartisanship. He was asked if he's speaking directly with Speaker Pelosi, and he essentially indicated that he doesn't see a real reason for that. There's also focus on phase 4, Chuck, and that might include infrastructure, but we'll have to see if that's something they can tackle. Chuck.
All right, and very quickly, Dr. Redlener, I want to get one more to you. The country is not succeeding at bending the curve, but Washington and California are. What can the rest of the country learn?
The rest of the country can and should learn that strict controls about movement, about sheltering in place, is really the only thing we have until we get real medications that will treat this virus specifically or a vaccine that'll prevent it. The only major tool in the toolbox is please adhere to these requests, these guidelines, to shelter in place, stay away from people, and do the best you can to adapt. And that's really, I think, the main message we get from them.
All right, that does it for me. I want to thank both of my doctors here, Nahid Bedalia of Boston University and Erwin Wedlener of Columbia University, and of course my colleague Kristen Welker. That does it for me. I'll see you on Sunday morning with another special edition of Meet the Press. My pal and colleague Ari Melber will take over after this break.
E-Trade, which isn't complicated. Their tools make trading quicker and simpler. that official after official at this task force briefing cautioned that they don't want people to go out and try to grab those surgical masks, those highly specialized masks that are sought after in hospitals across this country right now. And that is why you're seeing the CDC recommend face coverings, something less specific and less technical than those highly specialized masks. And I do think that's important. One other thing we should note is that the Surgeon General, I think, also gave some very important guidance. And that is that when people put these face coverings on or homemade masks or whatever they're going to use over the coming days, that they be careful not to touch their face with dirty hands, to wash your hands before putting these face coverings and masks on. Just some good common sense, I think, from the Surgeon General there to make sure that as people are adhering to these new guidelines, or at least trying to follow these new guidelines, that they don't infect themselves in the process. And I think that bears repeating as well, Wolf.
And when Well, listen, the important thing here is to get through the virus, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't examine the things that we've done in preparation for this. And you well point out that in California, at least, we now know that Governor Schwarzenegger had made pretty detailed plans for millions of respirator masks, thousands of ventilators, and these were taken out of the budget by Jerry Brown, who had plenty of money to spend on a train that's pretty wasteful in this state. We need to really
that's pretty
examine
wasteful,
these
John.
things
I
going
totally
forward
agree
and
with
learn
you.
from our history.
We got to wrap. John Cox, so sorry we ran out of time.
Thank you.
Does it for the Evening Edit. We hope you have a good weekend. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good night.
Behind us, we're all in this together. Here's Martha.
Hey there, Brett. Thank you very much. So there's an expression, you may have heard it. It goes like this: lead, follow, or get out of the way. We're seeing stark examples of all of those options right now. We're seeing some leaders who are leading. We followers, I guess you could call us, are staying home, we're washing our hands, we're doing all the things that we're told to do. Some folks involved in some parts of this might want to get out of the way for a little while all of this gets taken care of. We're seeing cooperation between some interesting places. The White House and some of its unexpected allies at times. You've got Governor Newsom of California.
And infected at least 266,000 more Americans worldwide. Cases have reached nearly 1.1 million. More than 58,000 people have been killed. It appears the president's task force is ready to recommend that all Americans now wear masks, a scarf, bandana, or some other
are voluntary, and he told reporters he will not be wearing a face mask. The president also shooting down guidance from his task force that he consider.
You see how controversial that one channel from another channel is? One says we're going to do it this way, another one says we're going to do it that way. I don't know if it's delayed information or if they just aren't on the same page of understanding what the president is doing and saying, but there's obviously conflicting messages that are being distributed to the people, which is making things that much more complex. And once more, it says in the Bible that Lucifer, Satan, is the author of confusion.
The CDC is advising the use of non-medical cloth face covering as an additional voluntary public health measures.
So you got a choice. You can either listen to the CDC, the disease control people that's supposed to know what they're talking about, or you can listen to the president. You got two choices. It's pretty obvious what we're going to do here. You got choice A, choice B. So what's the hang up?
It's voluntary. You don't have to do it. They suggest it for a period of time, but this is voluntary.
It's a recommendation until people go to dropping like flies. Whenever people go to dropping like flies, as the doctor said a while ago, if we have more cases that's similar to New York, where you actually have people dropping like flies, then it's no longer considered a a statistic, but then it is considered a fact. Once it becomes a fact, then you have a different set of dynamics. Once you have a different set of dynamics, then is whenever the CDC will say, we don't recommend, we're ordering you to put on the mask. It's like we go to different levels of control, different levels of authority, different levels of whether or not we're asking you, recommending you, or we're ordering you. So, people can take it for what it is. I personally am going to wear a mask. If I get around people, I'm going to wear a mask. I'm going to wear a cloth. I'm going to wear a handkerchief. I'm going to wear a bandana. I'm going to wear something over my mouth to protect myself and to protect others. And at the same time, I'm going to be conscientious about what's on my hands, and I'm going to wash my hands. I'm going to wash my hands and keep washing my hands and keep washing my hands until my hands basically ain't got much to wash. My advice would be that you cannot be too cautious in protecting yourself pertaining to something that's out there that you know that has caused this type of death to the human body. And you may get it, and you may get lucky, and it may not hit you just right, but then again, it may hit you, and it may knock you for a fluke, and the next thing you know, you wind up in intensive care, in a coma, and the next thing you know, they're throwing dirt over your head with your toes sticking straight up. Or maybe you'll be cremated, whichever way you want to go. Jesus. Why is it so complicated?
I don't think I'm going to be doing it. The masks, it's going to be really a voluntary thing. You can do it. You don't have to do it. I'm choosing not to do it, but some people may want to do it, and that's okay. It may be good. Probably will. They're making a recommendation. It's only a recommendation. It's voluntary.
That's the president. You can assess for yourself whether what he's saying meets the basic goal and purpose of this, yes, voluntary guidelines, which is to encourage more people to wear the darn masks. Now, by contrast, take a look at what Dr. Fauci said also today, his strong endorsement of people wearing masks if they can.
Putting a mask on yourself is more to prevent you from infecting someone else. And if everybody does that, we're each protecting each other, because the data is it's more efficient to prevent transmitting to others than it is to prevent transmission to yourself.
Policy, most Americans are still under stay-at-home guidance or orders.
You know how I see the mask? And I'm going to leave it at this. This is how I see the mask. We put mufflers on automobiles to quiet the sound. We put Cadillac converters on vehicles to eliminate the carbon dioxide. Between the muffler and the Cadillac converter, it helps to hold down the pollution control in regards to all the pollution, the carbon dioxide that's going up into the atmosphere. That's how we do it on automobiles. To me, a mask is basically doing the same thing. You're restraining a certain amount of possible chemical I'm going to use the word dew, as in a dew that falls on grass early in the morning. You're holding down the dew to the point of not contaminating other people by wearing some sort of a face scarf over your nose and over your mouth. And if the truth be known, the way some of these people's breath smell, they probably should have put this in order. They should have mandated this probably years ago towards people wearing masks, because some people has ferocious smelling breath. And I know it has to do with more than just teeth decay or gum decay. I know it has to do with what that human being has been exposed to, and their inner organs is basically rotting from the inside out, and they're probably just at the point of death is the reason why that they are putting out that type of foul odor to begin with. Some of it could be because they're not brushing their teeth, but some of it could be because of the things that they're engaged in doing with their body or eating that they shouldn't be eating, that's causing that type of a vapor to be coming out of their mouth. As far as I'm concerned, they should have been wearing a mask all along. It's kind of like putting a Cadillac converter and a muffler on an automobile. You're helping restrain some of the dew particles that are going to be coming out of that person by them wearing a mask, which helps for that one person not to be contaminating other people, and vice versa for the other people not to be contaminating you. And I personally believe that it's a good thing, especially if they don't have an antidote. Now, once they get an antidote, then people can become a little more relaxed towards what's going on pertaining to spreading this germ or this disease from one person to another. But as of right now, I feel like that it should be mandatory. I don't think it should be a suggestion. I feel like it should be an order for people to wear masks, because it protects both parties. And obviously they must think the same thing in other countries, because you take other countries, that's exactly what they're doing right now. They've all went to wearing masks because they know how that it's transmitted from one person to another. It just makes sense. I wish that there was some way or another that they could put a Cadillac converter on a jet airplane that carries cargo or carries humans. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to design an airplane that could help to hold down the chemtrails, but that's one reason why that the weather has gone bonkers. And since they have put out these orders towards banning aviation, we have seen the pollutants in the world, looking at it from NASA, that has almost practically healed itself overnight in some areas. The pollution rate has went to fog, and the pollution rate has dropped as much as 50% in some of the areas, and even more, because we're not producing all the pollution out into society that is killing our grass, that is causing cancer, that is killing the atmosphere and causing radical weather changes. People are going to have to wake up, not just to a microscopic germ, but they're going to have to wake up to all the above. This is happening to the world for a purpose, for a reason. And people need to wake up to it because of the reason why that it's happening. And it's been a harsh cost in regard to a wake-up call.
People in 9 states are still able to move around without operating under such a request. Dr. Fauci last night saying there should, though, be a national order.
I don't understand why that's not happening. As you said, the tension between federally mandated versus states' rights to do what they want is something I don't want to get into. But if you look at what's going on in this country, I just don't understand why we're not doing that. We really should be.
But of course, you have to ask yourself a question: how come the Surgeon General didn't start out telling people about the harmful conditions pertaining to tobacco use until later on throughout the 90s and the year 2000? Was whenever they started putting out the point blank towards what tobacco smokers can be exposed to. People that's pregnant. It doesn't no longer say it may cause serious health issues. It says it will cause serious issues. Well, what was in behind that? Towards delaying that? The good old American dollar. And it's called greed. The rich man controlling the rest of us to the extent of bringing bad health, bad conditions for all of us to have to endure. Good luck to all of us. Thanks again for listening. And shalom.